Okay, welcome everyone. Pleasure to see you all here. Welcome especially to the London School of Economics and Political Science to this event hosted by the Center for Macroeconomics and the School of Public Policy. My name is defied and I'm the director of the Center for Macroeconomics, and as you can see there, I'm also a Phillips Professor, or as it's sometimes known as the Curvy Professor. We are economists who hopefully got that joke. But I'm very pleased to join you here today to welcome Dr. Tao Wang to the LSE. Following the recent publication of her book, Making Sense of China's Economy, Dr. Wang is going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes with us reflecting on China's current situation and especially the very interesting trade-offs and challenges that it faces over the near future. Dr. Wang is currently a managing director and I think the head of Asia Economic Research at UBS, based in Hong Kong. And on top of that, she's also an invited fellow of the China Finance 40 Forum, as well as a member of the China Global Economic Governance 50 Forum. This to say that she is a true China expert. Again, I could keep on going on the number of institutions that she's a member of, including the Mainland Opportunities Committee and a series of other ones. But most importantly, in terms of content, she is a true China expert in the sense of someone who has thought hard, deeply, and for a long time on monetary policy in China, how to think about the very large debt that the country has, its shadow banking, the interaction between local government finances and the central government, trade disputes with the US, R&D internationalization, property bubbles, and many, many others. She shares some of that wisdom regularly in a column for Caixin, and is often, very often quoted in the media internationally. Before joining UBS, Dr. Wang worked at BP for a little bit, and before that at the IMF for about 8 years, where I think her involvement with China started on a professional basis, insofar as she worked with some of the negotiations with the fund or consultation, as the fund calls it, around safe enterprise reform, as well as bank restructuring. Dr. Wang received a PhD in economics from NYU and a bachelor's degree from Renmin University in Beijing, although I know that she has a special bond to the LSE, having been very happily married for quite a few years with an LSE graduate, which is a great honor. So we're very welcome to have her here. I'm supposed to say some things that if you're a Twitter user, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSECFM, then hashtag LSE Public Policy. And we are recording the event, so just so you know, you're being recorded, mostly so that we can then make it available as a podcast for those of you. So we're recording the sound, not the images, so it's okay, you can relax. If you want, you can put your feet down. The format is going to be where Tao is going to speak for the next 40-ish, 45 minutes. Then we will have a little Q&A with myself, and then I'll open up the floor so that many of you also have a chance to ask your questions and hopefully a super fun debate. On a personal level, or more personal may not be the right word, but on a personal level, I really enjoyed reading the book. Strongly recommend you get it. It is always, China is definitely a puzzling economy insofar as it faces trade-offs and characteristics that we don't find elsewhere, but it is still an economy. It satisfies economic principles just like any other area, and many of the lessons that you will learn in this august institution apply just with equal force. And what I really enjoyed about this book is to show you, in part, the power of economic analysis to make sense of, in this case, what's going on in the Chinese economy. With that, Tao, please, it's my pleasure to welcome you. Do you mind, please come on stage? I'm looking forward to hearing it.
Is that off? Yeah, I can do myself. Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Ricardo, for inviting me and for the generous introduction. And thank you, Jean, for connecting me to LSE. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I see many old friends, faces, and colleagues, and new friends. Great to see you. So in the next 30-40 minutes, I hope to maybe give you a brief introduction about the book, but I know that you probably have many questions, so I will leave maybe a little bit more room for question and make it a bit more interesting. So the motivation of writing this book, I have been in UBS. By the way, I need to clarify, the book is written on a personal basis and does not necessarily represent the UBS view. So I just want to have a disclaimer on that. And so for writing this book, it's really, I have been working in UBS for 15 years and getting questions on China from clients about every possible issues from every possible part of the world. And some of the questions do not change. And so I feel it's probably good to put that down in a more comprehensive way. Things like, how big is China's debt problem? China has a property bubble. Is it going to implode anytime soon? It's been, these questions has been there for a long time. When does Chinese consumers finally come to life and save, drive the economic growth and so on? So a lot of long-term questions. But I also noticed that the narrative on China's economy has changed. It changes sometimes with public opinions or political wind outside of China. Even within China, sometimes it changes as well. So I thought, I wanted to bring an objective and balanced way of looking at China's economy, and it's bring out the state of the current state of many contradictions in the economy. On one hand, it's very developed. You see state-of-the-art, airports, but on the other hand, there's also a lot of backward areas. You have big state-owned companies that seem to be everywhere, but you also have very vibrant private sector companies and so on. So a lot of seemingly, contradicting stuff. And also wanted to bring out the evolution of the economy and also policy-making process after the reform opening period since 45 years ago, and why has China's economy seemed to have defied many predictions of doom over the last 2 decades and seem to just continue to muddle through, and also try to bring out, I think, clarify some misconception, in my view, on China's policymaking and China's economy. I think if there is one takeaway that I would like for you and the readers to leave after reading the book or after listening to me to talk is, I hope that to be, do not extrapolate. I think so China's economy is quite complex, and also I think policy making and the government have been, in the past at least, being quite pragmatic and reductive to address the issues of the day. They may not be perfect solutions. They often are compromises and can create distortions for the future, but they tend to respond to the situation in the economy. And so it makes, when you extrapolate, I think one kind of discounts that unnecessarily. So that's one key takeaway. So let me just go through a few key points. And so the first point is, don't extrapolate. The narrative is not always so simple. Sometimes things are a little bit more subtle. And then I want to just mention a few misconceptions and give my view. Then there are a few topics. I will not go through the book, obviously, but I think one key issue that is in people's mind is the state taking more control over the economy than that's quite relevant debate right now in China. So the role of the state versus the market is something I want to talk about. And then I want to highlight some of the existing challenges in China's economy, things like debt, property, consumer, and things like that, that's been long-lasting and still here. And then also some new headwinds, the decoupling pressures, the geopolitical pressures, and the tech restrictions, the demographic headwind, and so on. And then give you a assessment from myself how things might go. So before I move to the chart, so the chart is not comprehensive, just some visual aid. Some misconceptions, I think. One thing often from investors I hear, and also if you read in the media and so on, there's an understanding that in China policy is really dictated top down, and there's an understanding, somebody's in power, he wants to do this, and so this is happening. That may seem to be more of the case recently, but in reality, Chinese government is not a monolithic apparatus. There's tension between different ministries, even if they are under the same government, same administration. There's powerful local governments, and they have their interests. Their interests are not always aligned with the central government. And so the policy making often is a compromise between those different parts. Then there are different stakeholders have strong influence as well on policies. For example, the state-owned enterprises is a very strong stakeholder in the economy. Their managers, their employees, and so on, they're a powerful political force. Local governments, I mentioned, the urban elite as well. So the example I can give you, for example, is on local and central government interest on the property sector. So the central government has been, for quite some time, wanting to prevent a property bubble, control property prices, and they worry about the risk, they worry about the unhappiness of urban population when property price goes too high, they worry about the risk associated with too much leverage in the property sector, too much resources going to the property sector, and so on. But the local governments, they rely a lot on the property sector for revenue. 30% of their revenue comes from land sales. So they have strong incentive to always make the property sector booming. And so they have strong incentive to, for example, withhold land supply, so land price can go up, and incentives to basically support the property markets, and they are not very keen on deleveraging and so on. So we had multiple rounds of property cycles in the past, and it often goes, the central government wants control, local governments does not, so property goes overheated, central government comes down very heavy-handedly, and then in the middle of the cycle, local governments and the economy is really suffering, then they kind of back out, and the public policy becomes supportive again. So you have a lot of policy-driven cycles, and we are just going through one of them right now. So that's an example, I think, when local interests and central government interests are not aligned, and so some policies seem, if you look through the policies, like, why is Chinese government doing this? But I think we need to think that the Chinese government is not one entity. There are many different parts, and the policy is often a compromise that's a bit distorted. Another example, I think, is about misconception and so on, is on the narrative of, what are the key driving force behind China's economic success in the last 4 decades or so. I have heard many simplistic narratives. So I think, in the early years, in the 80s and 90s, people probably understood it's the reform, it's the opening, that was the main driver. But later on, I hear scholars, both in China and outside of China, start to simplify it as, oh, China was able to grow because it had demographic dividends, and now demographic is turning, so it's not growing. Or China is growing because China joined the WTO and it's export driven, and then that is changing, so China is not going to grow. So, and then more recently, there's this narrative, both in China and outside, to say a big advantage, or in the US case, they say it's unfair competition from China, is the state involvement. The state has a lot of control, the industrial policy, and so on and so forth. So, and from China's perspective, maybe that is the driver as well of success. But I think all of these factors, of course, are part of the China story. But I just wanted to also, with the book, remind people that China started the reform and opening period in 1978 as 100% state control. And almost half of the population was under the age of 20. We had a lot of demographic, dividends, if you will, and state control. But that's not what drove China's success, because that's exactly at that time the government was really worried the economy was at the brink of collapse, in their words, and they are looking for ways to really rejuvenate and kickstart growth. And it is precisely the move away from state control and bringing market forces, inviting foreign investment, opening to foreign trade, allowing private sector to grow. It's precisely those kind of reforms that led to really the economic success of later on. So I think people sometimes forget about that and simplifying, whether it's WTO. I mean, lots of countries are in WTO. India joined WTO a few years before China, and that does not guarantee I think success in export or in the overall economy. Again, on the population, China had very young population for many years before it was successful, and many developing countries have that favorable demographics. Again, there's the thing in development economics, how to take off, right? It's not really driven by young population alone. So I think that's another example. And then on the WTO side, I also wanted to show that there's a very common misconception that China really took off after it joined WTO. But even with the trade, my point is that China did a lot of reform before it joined WTO in 2001. So even on the trade side, this is just an example. China's import tariff really came down in the 90s already, way before China joined the WTO, right? And China was open to foreign trade and invited foreign investment, started special economic zones in the 80s. So a lot of the effort was already made. And export as a share of GDP were rising, was doubling and quadrupling before the WTO entry. Of course, WTO really amplified that reform, and that is a period that export exploded. But it's not just WTO itself, and that I wanted to say, that it's reform plus opening. It's not, opening itself is not enough if you don't reform and make the domestic industries competitive and so on. So that's on the misconception part. So on the role of the state, so I mentioned that we started with 100% state control, right? And but the question right now is that after many years of reform and the state as a share coming down, are we reversing the trend? And that's a lot of question from people around the world, in China as well. There is this doubt, right? So I think, when we look at the role of the state versus the market, there are multiple ways of looking at it. State ownership, obviously, is an important one. And then there's also, from China's economy transitioning from completely central planned, completely state-owned to market orientation. There's another part, which is how economic activities are organized. Is it by planning with visible hands, or is it the market invisible hands? And then in terms of resource allocation, resource I'm talking about capital, labor, land, and so on, the productive resources, how are they allocated? Is via the state or the market? And then, of course, there's the industrial policy element of the state involvement. And also, another key element is the government's role in the general economy is in providing public goods, social protection, regulation, and so on. That's also a big part of the market. So I can go through a bit of that. And so in terms of the state ownership, so you can see, from nearly 100%, so the first chart is the industrial sector. From nearly 100%, it went down very sharply in the 80s, but most importantly in the 90s. In the 90s is a reform period where China really wanted to establish markets, and they did a lot. So it really started to allow private sector to grow and also privatizing some of the state-owned enterprises and restructuring some of that. So the share really came down. So if you look at the state SOE ownership in the industrial sector, so you can see that actually, if you read the media and you see the commentaries, you would have the impression that the state ownership is rising again, that the government is taking more and more a bigger part of the economy. But if you look at the ownership structure, not really. Things has been stable for the last 15 years or so. So it doesn't really, corroborate with that perception that the government is taking more control. I mean, that's the good news. The bad news is that it also did not decline. So basically for 15 years, that share has stayed. And that reflected, I think, the recognition that China will always have an important part, of the economy that's state-owned. They will not privatize. They wanted to make the state ownership strong, embrace it. It's part of the socialist economy, public ownership, in the so-called commanding heights industries, strategically important industries, and things like energy, financial sector, and so on and so forth. But even in the industrial sector, some of the state ownership stayed. So that's the the reality is that that there has not been major progress in SOE reform, in downsizing the SOE sector, although it hasn't really increased either. In the services sector, it's very uneven picture. So in the consumer services, such as retail and wholesale, lodging, and so on, it's predominantly private sector, 95% or so private sector. But in in financial industry, in some of the transport and so on, like airlines and railways, obviously those are state-owned. So it's a different picture. But of course, I don't have all the charts, but I want to say, if we talk about visible hands and invisible hands in terms of the role of planning, that role has decreased significantly over the last 40 years. And so as late as in the mid to late 1990s, we still had very detailed plans, but and the credit allocation by banks was also according to credit plans and so on. And that has changed, and a lot of that is done through the market. In terms of resource allocation, so that's an area that I would say that, again, there was quite a bit of reform in the 90s, but in the last 10, 15 years, there has been very little progress. And so the reform of the last 10 years was supposed to be adjusting the role of the state versus the market. So in 2013, the government published a very comprehensive reform agenda from the third plenum, 10 years ago. And one of the key focus is that. And so it was supposed to be that the government needs to increase its presence in public goods, in social protection, in regulation, and being sort of the referee of the market. But they need to exit and reduce its presence in direct production, in direct investment, and basically more of a referee, less of a player in the market. However, and then also one of the key words at that time is the market will play a dominant role in resource allocation, meaning allocating capital, land, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, what happened is that the government did increase its role in regulations. I mean, we saw recently with the platform companies, but even before then, the government strengthened regulation and supervision on environmental standards, on labor law, on things like that. They did increase social protection in terms of expanding pension coverage, healthcare insurance coverage, and basic education, and so on. But when it comes to exiting some of the sectors, the SOE I just showed you, the share did not really decline. So they didn't really exit from competitive sectors they said they were going to. In terms of resource allocation, is the market playing a dominant role right now? Not in many of the key resources. I mean, in capital, the banks are still predominantly owned by the state, and the government has a strong influence on guiding where the money is going. The state-owned companies have better access to credit than the private sector. On the land side, I just mentioned that local government sells land. No, local government are the monopoly supplier of land. They are the only supplier in that locality of new land. Once you get it from them, you can sell, but in terms of new land, only local government can sell them. Farmers also cannot sell them directly in the market either. So in terms of resource allocation, I think it has not become more market-oriented. And because of the regulation and because the government has been trying to divert to one sector or another, I think there's that makes the people in the market feel the government is more present than before, even if the state ownership has not increased. And so I think that gives this perception that the government seems to be really taking over, even though this ownership does not tell you that. And I have a chart in terms of the state's presence in the social area. So I mentioned that in the last 10-15 years, the government did increase its presence in the social areas, in public goods. However, despite that, its spending in social areas still dwarfs that of OECD countries. So, in a general budget, it only spends about 9% compared to OECD countries on average 27%, and then EU 33% of its budget on social stuff, which includes education, healthcare, public housing, pension, and things like that. If you include the pension, which are not, at the general budget, then China's share goes up to 16-17%, still much lower. So, to some extent, China is supposed to be socialist country, but in terms of providing social services and social protection, it's actually not nearly as good as the European countries or OECD countries in general. So that's an area that the government needs to continue to spend the money. So this comes to a question in terms of future. I'm jumping ahead myself a bit. When we talk about the future challenge of China, thinking about the aging population, you can just imagine that public spending responsibilities for aging population is going to rise significantly. So forget about local governments get involved in building infrastructure. They will not have so much money to do that. They really need to shift their focus in providing public services and social protection to the population. Otherwise, it's going to be a very big challenge socially. So that I'm getting ahead of it myself. While talking about the structural issues, it comes to my third topic. So I mentioned there are some long-standing challenges in China's economy. So one of the things is income inequality. China started with relatively egalitarian system, as it was socialist and so on. And after the market-oriented reform, inequality definitely increased very sharply. And so there's the inequality in general. There's also a big part of this inequality is the urban-rural divide. And some of that divide is really institutionalized by the hukou system, the land system, and so on. Hukou system is household registration system in Chinese, and basically you are born with it. It depends on your locality. You have that urban or rural hukou, but it's not just urban and rural. It's the Beijing hukou or Guangdong hukou, Guangzhou hukou, and so on. And Beijing and Guangzhou would have very different entitlement. And Beijing hukou obviously is the best, but the best is not necessarily in how much more you get. It's that if you are a Beijing resident, your children's chance of getting to the top universities where concentrated in Beijing is significantly higher than anywhere else. Example, when I was in college in Beijing, my class had 30 students, and my province took 1 student, me. Some province didn't get a chance. Beijing had 9. Okay, so you know that's for the urban. When I say urban elite is a force. So when China talks about, when the central government talks about we need to change the hukou system, it's unfair to so many people who right now 200 million people live and work in cities, but they are still called migrant workers. Where are they migrating from? From the rural area, and they don't have the same entitlement in terms of pension coverage, healthcare coverage. Their children cannot go to local school or take the exam to locally to go to universities. And government wants to change that. So immediately, I think there is a interest group that's against it. That's the urban people. They don't want to reduce the chance of their children going to school. They don't want the same service being provided to extra people. That means they are going to be the service they're getting are not going to be as good. So this is long-term challenges that's still existing. But without making changes to these issues, obviously you can see long-term problems that the rural children are not educated properly. That affects your labor force in the future. A scholar from Stanford called Scott Rosell has written very extensively on that. I quote his studies, for example. But also there are social issues, and there's social stability issues, because you have a big cohorts of the population are not getting equal treatment. They will not be very happy going forward. Increasingly, they will not be very happy. So you have to provide, and that's why the government is now talking about common prosperity, improving basic public services, and in lower tier cities, in rural areas. They talk about hukou reform and so on. So those are the challenges. Another long-standing issue, of course, is so-called unbalanced economic structure, meaning too much investment, not enough consumption. That's been an issue that's we've been discussing for 2 decades. It's still here. Consumption is still very weak. We have China's debt level, as I mentioned. People worried about China's debt crisis for more than a decade. In the meantime, debt as a share of GDP has risen more than 100 percentage points, and we are obviously still talking about that issue. And of course, the oversized role of the property sector as well. So some basic charts. So this is just a chart about the inequality issue that I mentioned. So this is the Gini coefficient. One is from the World Bank, China's Statistics Bureau also published it. You can see that it's very high, and the peak was around the global financial crisis, around that time. And so back in 2007, Premier Wen Jiabao mentioned that China's economy was unstable, unbalanced, unsustainable, and so on. And when the economy was growing at 14% that year, and part of the issue is that. And that imbalance is not just income inequality, it's also too much investment driven, too polluting and too much energy intensity and so on. So it's quite balanced for not only for the economy, for people, but also for the environment. And so, of course, then the global financial crisis came and China doubled down on investment. So it worsened some of the imbalance in the immediate years after. And then they start to address some of the issues. So I mentioned this here also because I just wanted to bring out that some of the policies that the government seemed to, tighten environmental standards and pushing for hukou reform and talking about common prosperity, which was a concept raised in 2012. All of this had a reason, right? And the policy turning more about the government needs to tighten certain standards, provide the social protection, and to increase its presence, because they were responding to issues at that time. And all these issues are very structural, so it takes a long time to make any improvement. We're still talking about it today. The rural-urban income gap widened very massively first, and now it's also coming down a little bit because the government has made some effort on that front. And then in terms of the consumption share, I just wanted to mention a couple of points. So as a share of GDP, consumption is very low in China. Total consumption just above 50%, household consumption barely 40%. As a comparison, in the US, household consumption is like something like 70% of GDP. And one, of course, during the stage of rapid industrialization in history, every country goes through that. The consumption share comes down, investment is a big part of the economy. This is China's case, just quite extreme. And this is partly because of the growth model was very investment driven, very capital intensive. So the household sector, their main income is labor income. Their income as a share of GDP was declining. So it's not just they like to save, but also they're not earning enough. That was a big part of that consumption weakness. How to change that? You need to change the growth model. And then again, we'll come to a lot of the structural challenges. So it takes some time. Of course, there's also the high saving rate of the population. And people save on average 30 to 40% of their disposable income. US on average, US is a bit of an extreme. In a steady state, something like maybe 8%, 5 to 8%, and at bad times, before the financial crisis was lower than that. Other countries generally maybe 20%, 15, 20%. Some countries are high, 30%, but China is just consistently high. And one of the key reason, of course, is lack of social protection. People are saving for their old age, for healthcare, for education. And so, if the government can improve that public services and so on, the protection, then people will not feel so insecure and they can lower their own saving rate. So that's, another part of the story. And so this just shows the debt level. I can answer more questions later on. I need to move on. I think I'm spending more time than I thought I would. So debt, as a share of GDP is now close to 300% of GDP, certainly higher than any country at the same development level, similar to US. But, we are a very different economy than US, certainly much poorer than US. And this chart just shows the oversized role the property sector has played. This is my estimate of the property sector's contribution to GDP. So in the first decade of this century, it was contributing on average a third to GDP growth. This includes all the indirect contributions. So China publishes, from a legacy of planned economy, publishes very comprehensive input-output table. And so you can see, financial services, how much is related to property, steel production, how much is related to property, and so on. And you add all those coefficients, it's about a quarter of GDP is related to property. The contribution to growth, deriving from that is about a third in the first decade, about 15% 10-15% in the second decade. Last year was highly negative. So going forward, certainly, the peak of property sector has turned. It will no longer be a key driver to China's GDP growth in the future. So now I get a lot of questions from clients that what is going to drive China's growth, right? So that's another challenge. And then I just wanted to move on to new challenges that will become more binding in the future. One is demographic headwinds. So China, people say the population has peaked. If it's not already peaked, it will peak in the next couple of years. Working age population has been in decline for 10 years, more than 10 years, and will continue to decline. And then also, labor is no longer cheap. China needs to really innovate more, but now China faces restrictions to access advanced technology by the US and allies. And there's also pressure of decoupling from China as well. So these are really new challenges. So I have facing these new challenges, I have a glass half full, glass half empty answer, right? So the half empty answer is, as I mentioned, these are all quite negative. I think restriction on access to technology will set China back. China will increase investment on R&D, but without access to advanced technology, from a macro perspective, you've got to spend more and get less return. What that means is lower productivity growth and lower potential GDP growth in the future. And that decoupling and fragmentation also means probably less investment into China, and people will try to diversify the risk, avoid the risk, and so on. China does not necessarily need the money of foreign capital, but I think what foreign capital brings, foreign investment brings, is technology, know-how, the best practice, and so on. I think you will lose on that if they don't come. An example, when iPhone came to China, initially Chinese value added was very small, very basic. It's reassembling, and then I think the increasingly the components, were more and more built in China as well. When Tesla came to China, that showed to the EV market what a industrial leader looks like. What is their standards? So then that really stimulated Chinese players to step up, and they become more competitive. So without those kind of inflows, I think there are going to be a setback, negative impact on China as well, which is very hard to quantify. But the glass half full story, and so on the demographics, I would say China's labor transfer is not yet complete. There are still 20 to 25% of the employment in the agriculture sector. OECD countries tend to be 3 to 5%. You don't need that many people. They are there not because they're needed, it's because they couldn't find better jobs elsewhere. And also, as I mentioned, the hukou system constrains people so that because your kids cannot go to the local school, your parents cannot easily move with you. So some people exit from the labor force, especially middle-aged women. They would go home, they have to take care of their parents, or they need to be there for their kids going through high school and so on. So I think hukou reform can increase labor participation and help that transfer as well. And the second thing is China's actual retirement age is 54. China's life expectancy is 77. And if you increase that by 3 years, by end of this decade, it adds 40 million people to the labor force, which roughly offset the decline in working age population this decade. So there are things they can do, not relying on birth rate miraculously goes up, and even if they go up, you have to wait for 15, 20 years for them to become labor force. So there are things to do. So I think, demographic headwinds is not really as binding as people think. I mean, you look at China right now, the big issue is unemployment, not we're running out of people. So I think that's the glass half full, is that there's still space there. The same with productivity gains. And so I mentioned that on the high-tech side, I think China will face constraint, and they're going to end up, the tech restrictions will, and the decoupling pressure probably will set the high-tech industries away from China, and they will have lower productivity growth in those areas. But China's overall GDP, per capita GDP level is still less than a quarter of the US level. That's a general, less than 20% actually. That's a general proxy for productivity in China. It's still low. And it's also reflected in per capita capital stock. Basically, how much machinery a labor is using. That's just simplistically said that way. Still small, still low. So that means there's a lot of space for China to apply matured technology, move up the value chain, upgrade technology and equipment in the manufacturing, in the services sector. So that's about automation, digitalization, and also a greener economy. So green transformation, because current China's economy is quite dirty, and you need to move to green. That means investment, upgrading, investment in those areas. So, there's still space to grow. So I'm relatively constructive that China will continue to move up the value chain, and so that will, and there's still space to invest. There's still labor. So therefore, despite all these challenges, I think China's average growth of this decade can still be above 4%, which is, significantly lower than the previous decade, which was 7%, and the previous decade, which was 10%. But, for an economy that's at $17 trillion growing at 4+%, that's still, the most important growth engine for the global economy. So I'll stop there. So I end on a positive note.
Wonderful. Well, myself. Great. So this was really quite a tour de force in covering so much. Let me pick you on, or let me query you on a couple of things. The first one is, as you noted, one thing that has been quite unique about China is the interaction between the central and the local governments. Mm-hmm. In some ways, that has been one of the reasons for the success of the country. The ability to encourage some competition, I might say, between different regions and local governments in a very virtuous circle. But it's also, like you said, a source of frictions and a source of distortions right now.
Yes.
Is that also something, from your examples, that I should not extrapolate from the past, insofar as, is that relation one that is improving, worsening, in the sense of creating both virtuous and vicious cycles? How do you see that as a factor? Because that was not one of your factors of growth for the future, is the extent to which that relationship changes.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's improvement or not improvement, but so the tension is definitely still there. So in the past, indeed, one of the key drivers is that central government gave local government a lot of discretion, and they were competing with each other.
There were good tensions.
They were good and bad. So they were good in the sense that they were competing for investment. They were competing to very pro-growth. The bad outcome is they often lead to repeated investment and excess capacity.
A lot of short-termism as well.
Yeah. So and they don't care about the environment. They don't care about financial risk, and they take excessive risk and accumulating debt, right? Because that's central government's problem. And so in the recent years, I think the central government has strengthened some control, imposed some restrictions on local governments. So some people say that it's a negative because local governments don't have as much incentive or as much discretion to grow anymore. But I think from a sustainability point of view, I'm not sure it's such a bad thing. I mean, first of all, I think local governments shouldn't be so involved in investment to start with. It should let the corporate sector do it. And secondly, I think for sustainability, so some of the restrictions are debt limit, right? Local officials need to be responsible for increasing the debt personally. So that makes them quite worried. And environmental standards, if there are major problems on the environmental side, they get a veto point as well. So yes, they have less discretion, but I think that's not all that. So they're changing a bit. But will they be fundamentally revamping the central-local relations? I think it's very hard because it's really politics, right? It's a political structure. And the thing is that local government officials from important localities are Politburo members, and no minister is Politburo member. So you can see, politically they are very strong. So it's not easy. So one thing about, that China has been trying to make pensions managed very decentralized way. They're trying to make pension portable. That could encourage, labor mobility and so on. It's very slow because, the rich provinces don't want to subsidize the poor ones. So yeah, I think they are changing, but
You see
it's
that as
slow.
neither a threat nor a new source of growth, more of an evolving situation.
Yeah, so
But it will be central.
yes, yeah.
Sticking with politically difficult things, I was quite intrigued by what you said that, well, given the retirement age, raising it by a few years would very easily solve the labor problem. Of course, raising the retirement age has also been the solution to deal with sustainability of pensions and social security
Yes.
in many, many, many countries.
Yes.
And that turns out to be just extremely politically difficult to see at all. The problem in China is different. It's not raising retirement age to save your social security, since, as you noted, the social
It is also
security.
going to be.
But at least not now.
Not-
Needed now, it simply has to do with
Yeah.
the labor force and so on.
Yeah.
What are the barriers in terms of a reform of that type, in terms of raising retirement age? Because the trade-offs are very different relative to, say, the United States or United Kingdom when it comes to raising them.
It's not that different.
Okay.
People don't like to have to work for longer, so they may not all go to the street protest as the French do, but they will show their displeasure. So recently there was a very small change on healthcare insurance coverage, and people went out to the street, and the government is backing down. So some issues, I think it's just common. Whatever system it is, people have
So in that
their
sense, not that
interest.
different.
Not that different.
Very good.
Yeah.
And on the similar line, talking about the debt problems, which, as you noted, I mean, if one just looks at the raw numbers, the debt in China seems scary.
Yeah.
But there's many senses in which it's very different insofar as given the relationship to the local and central government. But also, I would emphasize, or I would like you to react to the fact that the country as a whole, of course, is a massive saver.
Yes.
After all, it has these very large current account surpluses now for many, 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 many years, and has accumulated a lot of savings. So certainly for the country as a whole, it's hard to see a country with such a large external or net foreign asset position getting into debt problems.
Yes.
Is that, so I've always taken that as a sense of reassurance, that yes, debt to GDP, people GDP may be high, the private debt, but ultimately the country as a whole is a very big saver. Am I being too optimistic here? Do you think that there's a reversal on that, or that even the very large reserves or stock of savings of different types would still not prevent reallocation across parts of the financial system that could be very costly in a debt sense?
So I think, you're right. The high savings, high domestic saving is the key reason why China has not had a typical emerging market debt crisis, or even, the US type of debt crisis. And because, saving is high, so that the China's debt is 95% plus is domestic. So foreign investors may not like China, but they don't matter so much because it's domestic. And that saving, of course, is also largely kept at state-owned banks as deposit, which means that the funding of the financial system is relatively stable. You don't have to go to the market to issue bonds. For banks, they don't need to issue bonds to finance their lending and so on. And of course, because of the government ownership, people have this confidence their deposit will be honored, so the risk of bank runs is relatively low. And also because the banks are state-owned, the state has a lot of influence on them not withdrawing credit when the economy goes down. And so basically, typically debt crisis are liquidity crisis, and so the liquidity buffer is there because of that. But of course, it doesn't mean that's all good. We don't have a typical debt crisis, but we have debt overhang, and that means that the access or the companies or sectors that are not performing are not cleared out by the market. They're kind of dead weight on the economy, and the money is not going to areas that are growing faster. So we do have that issue. And then we, before the lecture, we talked a bit about the internationalization of the RMB. I think it's also related. So saving is high, but also importantly, we have capital control. So saving is at home, right? So if you open a capital account, there's pent-up saving going abroad, and then your liquidity buffer is going to be weakened. And so because of that issue, I think, the capital account and therefore RMB internationalization is really a long-term aspiration.
Very good. One last question and I'll open to the audience. It's extremely comprehensive, but there's one topic I think that you did not cover, in which usually our audiences are in London very excited, and that's digital yuan. The extent to which sometimes there's a fascination with the digital yuan is going to start being used everywhere in Soho here in London. But generally speaking, what would be your perspective just on that evolution, whether that's really a reality that will make a big difference, or is it just a interesting detail, and for those in the sector, but no more than that?
Well, will it be used everywhere? So the question is, will China completely losing capital control? No. So therefore, no. Because whether it's digital or the normal currency, right? So being spread globally, you have the capital control issue there. But digital yuan domestically is an interesting experiment. I think it's the PBC wants to expand that to also to get involved, I think, in the payment system as well, and reduce the cash management part, and to reduce the cost and so on. So for them, they have ways they have incentives to expand it, but again, they cannot go too far, because if they're still going through banks and other financial institutions to do that, because if you don't go through that, what happens with the the money multiplier, right? If the deposit generated deposit at banks and so on, if you just do it directly, what happens to that? I think they are still exploring that. Yeah.
Excellent. I was going to open it to the floor. If you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up. Then I'll call on you, and we have a microphone that will go to you. So, and I should say, I'm going to take the first one over in the corner. I should say, before you ask your question, if you just state your name and one sentence of who you are, if you want, LSE alum, student, media. It tends to be nice for the person in the audience to kind of hear what it is. Now, a couple of questions, you, and then you had your hand.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Wang. Thank you for your insightful...
Name and status, Judy.
Yeah. Okay. So, my name is Judy. I'm from the econ department. I really enjoyed your talk. So my question is that, do you have any sense about the heterogeneity of property bubble or debt level across different areas or cities in different development stages? Because when people are talking about how they think the housing prices in Beijing or Shanghai are crazy, I'm more concerned about those property bubble in those smaller cities. And I agree with you that the local government heavily rely on the selling of lands, but due to the slowdown of economic development and the potential outflow of population from those less developed area to the more developed areas, I think now it's more and more difficult for those areas to sustain the property price, and so it's also making the debt level more challenging in these areas. So what's your thought on that?
Good. Now to your right, no, just you need to, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I'm Liming Liu from School of Public Policy. My question would be, do you think there is a possibility for the Chinese government, maybe in the coming years, that they might have like privatize some major sectors, for example, electricity or finance, or at least we call it like pilot zone in China? Would you think that will happen in the future? Thank
Start
you.
with those two, and I already have a couple more. But why don't we start with those two?
Okay. On the first question on the property sector, yes, it's very uneven. It's a huge country and different factors, and so it's hard to say in general, property bubble across the board. I agree with you that I think tier 1 cities is a bit like London, hugely expensive, but rich people from all kinds of places come here to buy, right? The same in tier 1 cities. Rich people from all over China go to there to buy. So it's the lower tier cities that are seeing population outflows and not seeing much economic growth. One should really be worried about, even if their price is not so expensive. And local governments in those areas, they're going to face fiscal challenges. And so in the short term, I think they will have payment issues, some of them, and the government will ask banks to extend them loans and, in the short term, help them restructure some of the debt. In the medium term, maybe force them to sell some of their SOE shares and their other assets. In the long term, I think, the government may not realize that yet, but I think the reality is just they cannot have those kind of resources to do investment. They have to reduce their presence in the economy because there's no money coming to finance that. And in terms of, your question was about?
Like whether would you think there is a possibility that the Chinese government can
privatize
some of the key factors?
Well, on the so-called strategic industries, so for example, financial industry, electricity, I think that's going to be very difficult. I mean, in the electricity sector, there could be different players, with renewables and so on. The market could become more diverse. But I don't see them diversifying, privatizing the electricity. A lot of the power producers are already listed companies, so they are, but the grid system, that's a state monopoly. I don't see them, the distribution of electricity, I don't see them privatizing.
Very good. We got a gentleman up there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. My name is Paxton. I'm from ISI Capital, and it's a financial stock market, that sort of thing, company. So my question is related to that. I realize that we are basically creating our own evaluation system, because a lot of companies.
You can just speak up.
Sure, yeah. A lot of the companies that we do, when we evaluate their valuations, we use like westernized way to evaluate it. That is because it's a free market and the company is built on that kind of philosophy. But however, a lot of the companies, especially state-owned companies in China, they are not based on that idea. So there is a sound back home says we need another evaluation system to evaluate our own companies. I personally think that's fantastic. What do you think? After that, like you mentioned, the yuan is going more and more popular. Plus that evaluation system, would that give China some appealing look in the future? Thank you.
Gentleman all the way in the back.
Hello, my name is Evan Rivnak. I'm a political science and finance student from the University of Toronto. I am curious about, sorry, do you just want me to speak up?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I think we're good.
I'm curious about investment opportunities. I know you mentioned that China has low consumer goods spending, and I feel like there's a great opportunity over the next decade or so, maybe 2 decades, where that could exceed average returns, average market returns. I was curious your thoughts on that, and if you have any other areas where you believe there might be higher, or let's just say investment opportunities.
Okay. The evaluation system, the SOE evaluation with Chinese characteristic, that's the buzzword, and that's why the A-share market has gone up recently, driven by that. I don't understand it. So I understand why they think they are undervalued, the SOE shares are undervalued, and why they want to increase it. My question is, what are you doing to improve the performance of SOEs, right? Just talking it up is not going to make it last, I'm afraid. So, I mean, I understand why banks can improve because, you know, they are lowering the deposit rate, and so the NIMs, the net interest margins are no longer declining. The economy is recovering, so, you know, arguably the asset quality should improve as the economy improves. So, you know, banks, there's a reason for that. But other than that, I don't quite understand it, I have to say. If you want to evaluate in your own way, you say the foreign investors are wrong, the market is wrong, I think it should be this, then I think the market will say, okay, you hold it. So you play with yourself, right? The state money owns the state shares and it goes up and nobody else wants to buy it, and so what do we do then? So I'm a little bit concerned about that. I mean, I do see the argument of why some you know, banks or state-owned shares have its value. For example, you know, we know that the banks often play national service, but we also know they're not going to go bankrupt and they pay high dividends. So there's a reason, you know, from that perspective, that, you know, they're low risk, high income. So maybe you evaluate it that way, rather than a bank in the Western market. But yeah, other than that, I'm not sure. Question about the investment opportunities. So I am a firm believer that given where we are right now, consumption as a share of GDP in China will rise. And so consumer sector should outgrow the rest. And especially, you know, services, because with the aging population, you know, you need more and more service and not multiple phones or cars and so on. But, you know, are those good, you know, investment opportunities? I don't know, because the consumer sector tends to be fiercely competitive. So you have to find the right company and you see they have good returns. So I cannot advise you on that.
Very good. Next round, we have the gentleman there.
Hi, Bian Xue from Zhongwen Law Firm. Just a question, because it seems if I understood you correctly, you have made all the comparison of the Chinese system and the West. You mentioned about the restriction on Hukou, where the West globally you have the immigration system, and you mentioned about the interference of the state on the free economy of the market, and globally now the West, led by the US, have this restriction on free movements of goods, restriction on export control, and also equally we have this governmental subsidy. So in relative terms, there are a lot of challenges faced by the Chinese economy. And globally, in relative term again, with the competition between the Chinese and West, well, as led by the US, what is the chance and who are facing more challenge? Both is that would be by the Chinese or by the West? And what is the chance in comparative terms? The Chinese will win or the West will win in 10 years' time?
Thank you, Dr. Wang, for the very insightful talk. So my name is Leo, and I'm a policy alumnus, currently working in finance. So I've got two questions. The first one is, now you did a great job giving a clear overview of the challenges facing China ahead. Which challenges do you think are the major ones, i.e. where should the government start in the next decade to come? Second question is regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. So in the past few months, we've seen countries like Sri Lanka, Zambia, these countries potentially defaulting or have defaulted. And indeed, one of the major concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative is its focus investment in countries that don't necessarily have the infrastructure and regulations in place. So, to what extent do you think that's a major challenge for China, and how should China tackle that pitfall of the Belt and Road Initiative? Thank you.
And the very last question for this round, you're in the front.
Thanks. Gene Frieda from PIMCO. I had a couple of questions around the headwinds that you cited. You kind of talked about demographics and sort of answered that question in terms of potential positives, but in terms of the geoeconomic fragmentation and the tech restrictions, how do you, I mean, two kind of specific questions. Number one, on the tech restrictions, how do you think about that in terms of measuring the potential cost of growth? Obviously, it's state dependent, so if they put more on, that's one thing, but just in terms of the restrictions that have been put on already, how costly how does that fit with your view of 4% trend growth? Second one is, you know, at one level, the concern about risk control and debt control stem from a desire to self-insure against external pressure. How do you think about the risk, you know, that China is willing to bear in that sense? What are the constraints on growth that come from the need to maintain a sufficiently large current account surplus or sufficiently low growth in debt levels?
Very good. Last round.
Okay. I don't really, so on the West and China, I don't really see like who wins. It's really, I don't really see it could be a win-win situation. But unfortunately, politicians don't think that way anymore. So indeed, there seems to be us versus them kind of. But I feel that are people really taking the wrong lesson? I mean, as I started, like what's the source of China's success? And if we think it's the state involvement, I think that's really a wrong lesson to learn. I think precisely because of China moving away, allowing the market that generate that growth. I agree that the state needs to step up its role in social protection and regulations and so on, but it's not really about the state directly investing or, you know, all the subsidies. Industrial policy, I think it's a mixed outcome for China. It has been successful in areas when the government was really channeling or guiding, but let the market decide who the winner is, but guiding in that general direction. But they were not successful when the government was trying to pick winners and losers specifically. I mean, semiconductor is a very good example. That's the first industrial policy China had, already started in the 80s when China was not very far behind, and we are so far behind now. And especially those policies in the 90s when they decided we're going to import this one. After much approval, finally they invest, people have moved beyond to a completely different technology and so on. So I don't know if that's really the lesson to learn. But I agree with you. Unfortunately, we have trends that it seems everywhere government feels like they need to do that and they need to compete is not a good outcome. Who has more challenges? I'm a China expert. I'm not a US expert, so I cannot really compare. I think they all have their challenges and they all have their deep social issues to address. And Europe have its challenges as well. So it's not simple. So I cannot say. And for in terms of, you know, what is really the major challenges? There's so many. Where do I start? There are certain things I think one can see that's more straightforward, which is, you know, extending retirement age. Of course, they're going to do it very slowly, very gradually, because there's going to be resistance. You know, hukou reform is very difficult, but they're going to build more public services for the lower tier cities instead of allowing people to directly come into large cities to compete for resources. So that will make the political tension a bit lower. So I think they need to actually do more SOE reform and reform about resource allocation to improve efficiency. I'm not very hopeful that there are going to be major progress in that areas. And then I think also I mentioned, one key factor about China not to extrapolate is the government has been quite pragmatic and adaptive. So going forward, my concern is that will they continue to be pragmatic and adaptive, especially when now there's the geopolitical tension and when there seems to be more concerns about national security, about those kind of things. Can the government remain pragmatic and then address the issues still at hand? I think those are big challenges. On the technology side, of course, but I've already answered that a bit. But I can answer Jean's question about the impact. How do you assess that? It's very hard. I've already taken down my potential growth for this decade by 0.5 percentage points because of that tech restriction. My basically big ballpark estimate is it's really assumption about you have to invest more, you get less and lower productivity growth. But there's a lot of uncertainty as to the impact and how restrictive will the tech restrictions be. Is every country going to join and very expensive, or is more targeted? So the impact potentially could be bigger if it's more restrictive. And it also depends on how China responds. I think that China has to keep the system open. It needs to increase protection of intellectual property rights domestically to foster innovation. And it's not just about money. I think they seem to not always understand that. It's not about pulling billions and billions and then you get innovation. So again, that there's uncertainty there. So I have encouraged people like the IMF and so on. I said, you guys work on it. Tell me how much the impact is. You have more resources on that. And I haven't, I hope they will continue to work on that. The question about the BRI initiative, yes, I think China faces some setback on that area. A key thing is many of the BRI countries just cannot afford it, and you have payment issues. And also domestically, I think people are wondering, we have a lot of problems at home. Why are you giving cheap money abroad and forgiving debt and so on? So it's not very popular, But then there are also political pushbacks from some of the host countries, right? They given the concerns about national security and so on, people kind of, are a bit reluctant in some countries. I think strategically, Belt and Road Initiative is still very important for China, so they will continue to stay on that strategic thinking. But in terms of actual investment, outbound investment and lending and so on, I think it's going to be relatively slow moving forward because of the reality. On the debt risk control, the question about debt risk control or current account. So I don't think they're particularly worried about current accounts coming down. I actually don't really see current account going highly negative either, given the focus more on domestic resilience, domestic supply chain. But in terms of debt risk control, I think that's going to be an ongoing long-term kind of constraints that yes, they want to achieve a certain kind of growth, but they do have to worry about sustainability. So therefore, in the past, during the trade war and pandemic, China was more modest in stimulating and printing money. I think that will remain the case.
Well, thank you so much.